Hey, Mark. Hey, everybody. First, thanks for the warm introduction. And just as a note, I'm not sure I like the segue of learning or of trends you want to have die, although I agree with the pandemic, for then top trends in learning today. So
let's get rid of that. You bet.
Thanks for that. Aren't we good?
Can you see my screen?
Yes, thank you so much. So it is both a pleasure and honor to be here. Lauren and I will be talking about not trends that we want to die, but the top learning trends of today. So Lauren and I are with Illuminate. We are a clinical sales training firm out of Boston. We work exclusively with pharmaceutical, biotech, and medical device companies. Let's take a look at what we'll cover today. So everyone in the learning and development space likes to be on the cutting edge of trends. And the hot trends that we see right now include immersive learning, augmented reality, virtual reality, and social learning. But just because we can add a shiny new tool to our toolbox doesn't mean that we have to, nor does it mean that we always have to use them. Today's learners of today look for purposeful innovation, and they look for modern technologies in their training. And it's our job as learning and development professionals to discern when, why, and how to utilize current trends to deliver impactful training. Towards that end, we will discuss today how learning trends have evolved, the benefits of effective implementation, and practical tips for applying new trends, including instructor-led training, and most importantly here on this one, the impact as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll talk about video-based learning, collaborative and social learning, message-based learning, and lastly, immersive learning with augmented reality and virtual reality. We, on a consistent basis, Lauren, myself, and our team, we consistently look at what the market, what learners want. And so we've identified these strategies after researching current trends in learning and development. We're consistently, as mentioned, we're consulting with thought leaders, subject matter experts, prospective clients, and our clients. So just as a note, trends don't appear out of nowhere. And sometimes trends that seem to have nothing to do with learning, such as social networking or VR gaming, they influence how people expect to learn new information and how we deliver it. So first, take a look at the evolution of instructor-led training. So let's kick this off with a quick poll related to the return to in-person training. So Stephanie, can we conduct poll number 1, which is instructor-led training?
Absolutely. I will pop that up on the screen.
Thanks, Stephanie. So here, if you can weigh in on which of the following best describes your organization's current use of instructor-led training.
We've got those responses coming in right now. It's a bit of a tie between a blend of in-person and virtual, and primarily virtual. And then very, very low in the running is primarily in-person or no training. I'll give everybody about another minute to get your responses in. Just click right there on your screen, and then I'll share the results. All right, I think this tie is where it's gonna win. So there you can see the results.
Interesting. So primarily virtual, it's interesting because that's the world that we've lived over the past couple of years. Thanks for sharing, all of you. We're seeing similar in our space. We are seeing it start to shift back to in-person or really be a blend. And we'll take a look now as to how it's evolved. So we want to step back and think about how instructor-led training has evolved in recent years, because it certainly has evolved, right? So we're kind of putting it into 3 buckets. And it all revolves around the advent of COVID-19. So we have pre-pandemic, pandemic, And then post-pandemic, which some folks might argue that we're not quite post-pandemic yet, but Lauren and I are wishful thinking that we're almost there. So like everything else in our lives, COVID-19 has radically altered how training was conceived, created, developed, and delivered. Before the pandemic, most training professionals firmly held the conviction that in-person, instructor-led training, so workshops, was essential and irreplaceable, and that virtual instructor-led training at the time was best reserved for either kind of content-heavy presentations or didactic presentations. For decades, instructor-led training has been the most popular type of training. When you looked at trends 5 years ago, instructor-led was still on that. When you look at trends 10 years ago, same thing. Instructor-led training was the most popular type of training. As we all know, COVID-19 upended all of our carefully laid plans and challenged everything that we thought we knew about training and how best to do it. The pandemic essentially forced the rapid shift from instructor-led training to virtual instructor-led training. Training companies like Illuminate, wanting to survive and thrive, we quickly had to adapt to virtual instructor-led training as a sustainable training solution. In the post-pandemic era, this is, section 3, we see the creativity and innovation generated during the pandemic carried through to current training approaches. So we see a lot of the innovation and creativity that came from the pandemic still being carried through to post-pandemic. We've recently seen an uptick to in-person training, and largely because we all want to get back together in person. We miss our colleagues. So we're seeing this movement. We're also seeing the continuing need for flexibility. And lastly, we've seen evolving approaches to blended learning. The post-pandemic shift is not only here to stay, but the speed of changes and new innovation is accelerating. And we need to be able to select the right modality for the right training. So considering instructor-led training, both in-person and virtual, how do we strategically maximize the benefits of each approach? So let's start with instructor-led training. We see the maximum benefit when it is used for application-based training, experiential hands-on training, collaborative learning and team building, and when we need to move a variety of learners across a variety of experiences. So if we have different audiences, and I'm talking about in person, so it's when we need to move this group to this room and then maybe take part of this group and move them somewhere else. So clearly in person is beneficial when using that. Now, and we all know that we've lived not in that world for the past couple of years, but this is where we see it moving forward. And while virtual instructor-led, was the only way that we trained for the past couple of years, we see moving forward it being an excellent choice for presentation of didactic content, knowledge reinforcement of in-person instructor-led training or other types of training. And virtual sessions work really well for peer-to-peer discussions and best practice sharing. In the post-pandemic era, we see an even greater need for a heightened blended learning program. So in addition to the choice of in-person, virtual, we see a greater focus that has been called upon us that, we need to look even more at how do we blend in e-learning programs? How do we blend in different touch points into the curriculum? Learners want more variety in how they are engaged than ever before. So what we're looking at here is an example of a highly blended approach that we've recently developed for a client's product launch. So first, we start with a multimodal 2-week home study program that builds foundational knowledge. And you'll see there's a lot of different items, videos, e-learning modules, daily check-ins. So learners went through this program relatively at their own pace, and this was in preparation for a 3-day virtual meeting where learners practiced applying what they had previously learned. From there, learners then dove sort of back home from a virtual world, even though they were home all along, but into a multifaceted 1-week home study program focused on the product. This was then in preparation for a 3-day in-person launch meeting with workshops featuring role plays, application activities, games, and group collaborations where learners applied, practiced, and synthesized all previous training from time before. So I'm going to pause there and see if we have any questions or comments on the evolution of instructor-led training throughout the past few years.
I don't know if we have any questions yet. I do see a comment in the chat saying the training that they do has to be in person because their industry regulator requires it.
Interesting.
It'll never die.
It will, in person will never die, nor will virtual. It's here to stay. What we're finding in our space is, and the benefit of it, that we're seeing what used to always be a call to fly the team across country for a big meeting, or the urge to do that. It's like, wait a minute, we don't need to do that. We don't need to book hotels, book airfare. We can take 3 hours or 4 hours out of a virtual day or out of a few different days rather than doing that. So it's people, I think, or our clients are being more efficient at kind of how they're picking and choosing how they deliver it, whether virtual or in person. Lauren, would you agree?
Absolutely. I think it's really about a mindset shift of, we've seen that we can do instructor-led in person. We've done that for decades. We've seen that we can also be pretty effective virtually, as we all discovered over the last few years, whether we wanted to or not. And now we have a little bit more choice, right? Depending on the industry, depending on the organization, there might be a need for one versus the other, depending on circumstances. But we now have this choice where we can say, how do we strategically leverage both to maximize their benefits, which I think is a really great place to be. All right. Well, with that, I think we can move on to learning trend number 2, video-based learning. So, the use of videos for learning isn't exactly new, but it is a trend that continues to evolve over time. So it's important to keep a pulse on how it's changing, and most importantly, how we're leveraging it for training. So when we consider how the use of video just in everyday life has changed over the years, platforms like Netflix, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, TED Talks, and TikTok, some of these are likely to come to mind. And while we might be inclined to think that these platforms have very little to do with training, they have changed the way that we consume content, which in turn has impacted how the modern learner expects to learn. Adults have come to expect ample opportunities for multimedia, as well as engaging and even entertaining videos for learning. And we also expect videos to be short and concise, which is in part thanks to platforms like TikTok and Facebook Reels, but it can also be attributed to the popularity of microlearning in L&D across industries over the years. So we're going to take a look at some best practices to keep up with this trend when you're using videos for learning in your organizations. First that we have here is that it's critical to keep video duration in mind. When we think about videos in learning 10 to 15 years ago, chances are that it was a recorded lecture or a presentation by an expert, upwards of an hour long. But there was a study done a few years ago to determine the impact that video duration has on learners' completion rate. And you can see some highlights from the study here on screen. But what it found is that when a video was up to 6 minutes long, there was a 100% completion rate. But when the video was 9 to 12 minutes long, it was only a 60% completion rate, meaning that 40% had dropped off. And when it was 12 minutes or longer, it was only a 20% completion rate. Now, does this mean that every video needs to be under 6 minutes? No, not necessarily. It's still important to ensure that you're achieving the objective of your video and that you don't sacrifice content just for the sake of keeping it at 6 minutes or less. But it is important to keep this in mind to ensure that your videos are focused and to the point, and also to consider if you can break a longer video up into chapters or bite-sized chunks to ensure that you're keeping your learners engaged. The next best practice we have here is to invest in an authentic voice. Some of you might be familiar with Richard Mayer, who's an American psychologist who's done a lot of research in cognitive science. And he's well known for his 12 principles of multimedia learning, 2 of which are known as personalization and voice. And when we look at these principles together, they really speak to the importance of using a conversational tone for learning, as opposed to more formal language, as well as the importance of using an authentic human voice rather than a computer-generated voice. And this is really so that learners feel that they can relate to the training that they're listening to. Next, we have here to look for opportunities to embed interactivity into your videos when appropriate. And we're going to speak more to this momentarily, but interactivity can be a powerful way to engage your learners and ensure that they're active participants as opposed to passive learners. And lastly, embed emotion when appropriate and where possible into videos. Research in neuroscience actually tells us that the brain remembers an emotional experience more than anything else, and that can be negative or positive emotions. So this might look like embedding excitement in a video to get learners motivated and hyped up. It could be including an element of surprise by catching learners off guard in a video, or it could be empathy. And we work in the life sciences, and so conveying the emotions of a patient experience through video is critical to the work that we do. But all of these best practices, they can really have a positive impact on learner engagement, but also on learning retention, which we know is critical to the work that we do. So the type of video that you select for training is going to depend upon multiple factors. Ideally, it should depend on the training objective, but we also know realistically that there are other factors that are going to impact the type or style of video that you choose for training, such as your production timeline, of course, budget, available resources like available technology and whether you're using in-house talent or outsourcing, and also the expected lifespan of your video. So if we at Illuminate are creating a whiteboard video on anatomy and physiology within the human body, that video is likely to have a much longer lifespan than, let's say, a software training video for a product that gets monthly updates. So that lifespan is also going to impact the amount of investment with time and budget that you make into a video. But as we're focused on the training objective today, Shaun and I took a look at some of the main objectives of learning videos within the work that we do. And we identified specific types and styles of videos that we see as being most effective for each of these broad objectives. And this is certainly not intended to be an exhaustive list. We acknowledge there are many more types of videos out there, but these are some of the ones that were most relevant to what we see. So first and foremost, the most common objective we see of videos for learning is to provide the learner with visual explanations for a challenging concept or topic. In life sciences, we often find that text and images just don't suffice when it comes to explaining, let's say, the pathophysiology of a disease in the body or the mechanism of action of a product. So this is where a whiteboard video or a 2D or 3D animated explainer video is really powerful and effective. But even on the simpler side of things, when it comes to cost and production, a narrated slideshow can help the learner both listen to an explanation with a voiceover while also seeing animated images on screen. Next, videos can be an impactful way to allow learners to hear directly from a subject matter expert, their leadership, or even their peers. So this might take the form of a panel or interview style video, such as hearing from a panel of physicians or medical experts who can speak firsthand to the patient or physician experience with a particular disease. But we've also seen Zooms come a long way in just the last few years for obvious reasons, with making it even easier to collect user-generated video. as well as some of the video platforms Shaun's going to speak to in just a little bit. It's really become more accessible and more feasible for organizations to collect user-generated videos and have those shared among peers. As I mentioned earlier, video is a powerful way to convey emotion, and this can take the form of a live action video, such as with actors or even real employees or patients. But also the use of stock imagery and stock video can be highly effective at conveying emotion with the appropriate tone and voiceover that's layered into the video itself. And lastly, we've placed here on the screen interactive video, and we've placed this into a category of its own as a way to engage your learners. We see this as a trend in and of itself, so we're going to take a deeper look at just interactive video specifically. We're really seeing interactive film, across the board outside of the context of training gain popularity, and this has been happening over the last several years. And here's just a few examples of interactive film that are available on Netflix. The You vs. Wild at the top left of the screen here is a family favorite to watch with my boys at home. This is where you get to watch the main character navigate some crazy and even pretty dangerous situations out in the wild. And they're presented with some decision points. So you as the viewer get to decide how the actor should overcome certain challenges, and then you get to see it play out to see what's the outcome and the result. So we're going to dive more into the details of using interactive video within the context of training. But Stephanie, if you could pull up the next poll on video-based learning, want to just get a sense from the audience of how familiar everyone is with interactive video. So if you can take a minute and respond to see which of those responses most accurately describes your familiarity, that'd be great.
All right, we are getting a lot of responses coming in. So far, I'd say the top one is familiar with interactive videos, but haven't developed any personally.
Okay.
I also saw a comment in the chat. I lost many hours of my life watching Bandersnatch.
That's a popular one.
Yep. All right, I'm going to end the poll and share these results on the screen so everyone can see them.
All right. Yeah, definitely most popular there about familiar with how they can be used for training, but haven't developed them. We do have about 20% who have developed them, which is great. So certainly feel free as we're going through this, drop some things in the chat with your own experiences. That would be really helpful. And then about almost 20% familiar in everyday life, such as Netflix, but not so much for training. So thank you for those responses. That's really helpful to see where everyone's at. So we're going to go ahead and look at interactive video within the context of training. Interactive video within the context of training is also gaining traction, and there are many different platforms out there that support this, including Storyline or Kaltura. We've placed a few other examples on the bottom of the screen here. But some of the ways we can see interactive video being effective is really by giving learners control and making them active participants, which in turn naturally boosts engagement. We can embed branching scenarios as well as decision trees, or even choose your own adventure to put learners in the driver's seat, allow them to choose the content that they want to explore or the decisions that they want made. So I'm about to show you an example which was used for recruiting at Deloitte to help viewers determine if they would be a good fit for the organization. This interactive video was created with the platform Kaltura, and you'll quickly see how the same concept could be applied to enhance more traditional training and allow learners to make decisions. So I'm just going to make sure I'm sharing my sound. Shaun, if not, let me know early on.
I will.
All right, we will go ahead and watch.
Excuse me, Darren. I spilled something on your jacket. Sorry.
Okay, so what I love about that video, aside from the humor, and I just think it's very well done, is that learners get to make decisions, and then they get to see the natural outcome of those decisions. It also incorporates feedback, so there's a self-assessment element to it. The feedback is immediate, and it even gives the opportunity for the learner to do a redo, right? If they chose pretty poor choice on the first time around to keep quiet, they get a redo. And not all interactive video within training is going to include these same elements. Some, might not include the element of feedback or the opportunity for a redo. But you can see how this is a far more engaging and even memorable experience than simply watching a video, let's say, about character traits needed to work at Deloitte. So this video actually does go on for several more segments, very entertaining, I would say, and humorous. So Stephanie, if you can share that link to the video in the chat, if you didn't already. I can't see the chat while I'm presenting, but highly encourage you all to check it out.
I'll get it right up there for everyone.
Perfect.
And Lauren, I would just second, if by all once Stephanie, not during our presentation, but when Stephanie gets the link out, there are several sequences post this one that are really entertaining. And just, Lauren, to note, you had mentioned earlier, training does need to be entertaining these days. And I've heard the term coined edutainment. So I think that, clearly the modern learner of today requires that. So I'll pass it back to you, Lauren. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you watch this, keep in mind how you could leverage a similar concept for some of your own training needs. So we'll go ahead and move on. So additional features that can be incorporated into interactive video, aside from branching scenarios or decision trees, are also interactive quizzes or even polls. And so this is really layering on, let's say, knowledge checks or questions to give learners the opportunity to check their understanding while they're viewing the video. And so this is a nice alternative to having learners watch a video in its entirety before then providing knowledge checks within, the e-learning platform itself. You can see here on screen, there's a few examples. You can also incorporate pop-ups with hotspots with additional information, or even links to additional resources. So let's go ahead and see any questions related to video-based learning that we can answer before we move on to the next trend.
We do have one question. So these interactive videos, can you incorporate those into your LMS and get the results of what people clicked on, which branches they went to, how many tries it took before they realized they should probably mention that they spilled coffee, that kind of stuff?
It's a really important question, right? When it comes to data and being able to track user interaction. And as far as I'm aware with some of the different platforms, it's really going to depend on the platform and how the file is exported. So it's really going to come down to the platform that's being used. So I would say, if you're exploring the option and looking at some of these platforms in particular, that's one of the top questions that needs to be asked before diving in, to ensure that if that is important, in terms of what you're tracking with user engagement, that you're able to collect that on the back end. It's a great question. Shaun, anything to add from your perspective there?
Yeah, I mean, it is going to depend on the platform. And I know that a question came up as you were talking as to the Deloitte video, as to what it was developed in. It was Kaltura. So I think that would be a good source as well to look to as to what can be tracked. Lauren, when she did the video as to we tracked it, consistently hit, don't tell the guy or rub it in. So
there's a part a little later where you have to have attention to detail, which I thought was one of my strengths, and I discovered it's not based on my response. So encourage you to check that one out. Any other questions?
Yeah, last question about interactive videos. Do you know how many hours it would take to build something like that? I know that's a pretty broad question because it depends how many branches there are and how many different scenarios.
Absolutely. I mean, when it comes to the branching element, I would say that's the most complex to build, right? When we're talking about knowledge checks and kind of layering on what I would consider a little bit more just engagement at the surface level for learners, that's going to be a lot easier, of course, to implement as opposed to a branching scenario. There are some tools out there that actually allow, in terms of storyboarding with branching, that can be an effective resource so that you're not starting from scratch and trying to map out all your branches on your own. So there are some, authoring resources out there that can make that a little bit easier in terms of writing and planning for the branches, because it does need to be well planned, right? To ensure that, one branch isn't going to take 20 minutes to get through, and to make sure that it all maps out. So yeah, it's really going to depend on how many branches, how many decisions, and how far along each one gets. Shaun, anything to add there?
I think you covered it.
Okay.
All right, thank you. I think that's all the questions we have right now.
Thank you.
All right. Then Shaun, I'll pass it to you for trend number 3.
Thank you, Lauren. So trend number 3, we're going to look at collaborative and social learning. And collaborative and social learning is not a new concept. It's really just a new term for something that we do day in and day out, which is we learn from one another. One thing I find fascinating about the trend collaborative and social learning, when we did a learning trend presentation probably about 4 years ago, top 5 learning trends did not include collaborative and social learning. But you can see from the graphics on screen that it is now within the top 2, and it's steadily rising. What used to be called water cooler talk, or when we were in the office, and some of us are in the office, we would turn to someone, ask a question, or they would share, some information that they have. Those are forms of collaborative and social learning. It's, it's something that we do already. And if it's something we do already, which we do, why is it so much on the rise as you see in the screenshots? Well, clearly the impact lies both in the impact of social media and then also by the disruption caused by the pandemic. So social media has created new and increasing expectations for adults to be able to interact and collaborate differently with others. As well, they want to interact, and I think that the video example was a good one. They want to interact differently with media. So this, then coupled with the unparalleled impact of the pandemic on how we organically engage, accelerated the shift to a more organized and sometimes complex collaborative and social learning. As a result, we had to adapt and think differently as to how we foster these ways of learning. So why should trainers care and learning and development professionals care about collaborative and social learning? First, it is expected of the modern learner today. The modern learner of today wants to be an active contributor to their own learning rather than a passive receiver. Collaborative and social learning puts the learner at the center of training, so it's learner-centric as opposed to facilitator-centric or presenter-centric. Collaborative and social learning draws the learner's experience, skills, and knowledge, which we all know is a principle of adult learning. And then lastly, collaborative and social learning ensures that training is relevant. And it also further facilitates self-reflection and best practice sharing among peers. So let's take a look at synchronous learning opportunities for collaborative and social learning. So first, let's level set. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but let's just level set on synchronous learning. So with synchronous learning, learners are all learning in the same place, whether it's in person or virtually, and they're learning at the same time. So the pandemic caused learning and development professionals to rethink, how do we foster social and collaborative learning in a virtual setting? And I think all of us learned pre-pandemic, we used to have some of these calls with no cameras on and it was just voice. And we quickly learned in the pandemic how we needed to have virtual happy hour or how we had to have family time over Zoom. So, we had to really challenge ourselves, how to think this through, like, and we're continuing to do so, like what can be done virtually, and then also what can be done from a social and collaborative learning perspective. The tiles that you see on the left, these are various learning synchronous solutions that we developed with our clients, both virtually and in person. So they include group projects, partner sessions, best practice sharing calls, and case studies. So, the learning deliverables that we all as a learning community continue to develop, and it continues to evolve. There are some in-person solutions that I think we all can agree we were able to replicate virtually. And then there are other in-person solutions that still are better left in person. I think we all can agree that through this process, it's nice to know that we have the choice now. Some best practices that we've learned throughout the process for social and collaborative learning: be sure to provide clear structure and expectations. Be sure, and with us control freaks, it sometimes isn't easy to do, but be sure to put the learners in control. Allow ample time for collaboration. Learners won't effectively learn if they're rushed. And I think that we probably all have been there, that they also won't effectively learn if they feel like we, as learning and development providers, are trying to put 10 pounds of content into a 5-pound sack. And then lastly, ensure that the content is relevant. Adults can pretty quickly see when training isn't relevant. Be sure that the training is authentic. Now let's take a look at asynchronous learning opportunities for social and collaborative learning. I really get excited about this, and I think Lauren can concur that I do. There are some really cool tools out there. So first, since we defined synchronous, we'll define asynchronous. So unlike synchronous, asynchronous learning occurs at different times, at different places, for different learners. So it can be online courses, online discussion forums, collaborative platforms, to name a few. So asynchronous learning, asynchronous social and collaborative learning usually requires the use of technology. And so today we have the benefit of strong asynchronous platforms. And what I really get excited about are the ones that include video, which are shown here. So there are platforms such as Rehearsal, SmartWinner, and Loom, which all have different aspects to them. But one of the things that excites me about these platforms, so they all have a video component where you can record role play scenarios or responses. So I would record it as a user, and then I would submit it to whether it's training manager, coach, or my manager for feedback. The powerful thing about these tools is that what we're seeing on average is that learners will record themselves on average anywhere between 5 to 8 times before they sort of submit it on. And what's powerful there is that if we were to be role playing in a workshop setting, normally we would do it once, someone would provide feedback, which usually is, you did a great job, and then they would move on. So this is a powerful opportunity for learners to fine-tune their skill. Vince Lombardi, who is a famous Notre Dame football coach of years past, said, it isn't practice that makes perfect, it's perfect practice that makes perfect. And I think that the recording capabilities of these platforms exemplifies this. So one of the cool things too is with these platforms, or these video platforms, not only can I record, I can send to my manager or coach for comment. And so feedback can come back to me, of which I then can learn. Additionally, there are gamification and leaderboards that can be enabled with some of these platforms so that the top videos can be shared to demonstrate what great looks like. Lastly, the benefit of continually using these platforms is that they can create a library of user-generated videos that new hires can later refer to, or existing learners can later refer to as just-in-time training. Lauren, do you want to take the next slide?
Sure. Yep. So collaborative and social learning can also be supported in an asynchronous environment, aside from video platforms like Shaun just shared about. but also with social learning platforms. And these can be supported, within an LMS, or they could be supplemental platforms, in addition to an LMS. So traditionally, if we think about an online discussion forum, right, we're probably all familiar with that format. It aimed to serve the purpose of sharing knowledge among peers. But probably anyone who's ever participated in one can tell you that they fell short, right? And there's multiple reasons for this, but primarily because learners really had little motivation to return to the forum to see their peers' comments or reflections. I can think back to online grad courses where, you make your own post and the professor had to require us to comment on 2 peer posts, and you do the bare minimum and say, great, I agree, really insightful, and you move on and never return, right? So at its core, social learning platforms really provide a modernized approach to sharing knowledge, and they provide an experience that learners are accustomed to based upon social media. So these are platforms that allow users to share content or resources by posting links, like to a video or an article that they found valuable. They can post reflections or even ask questions of their peers. And this serves to replicate how peers might turn to one another to ask a question in the office. They can comment on a peer's post, just like in social media, to share their own knowledge or responses or reflections. And some platforms even support upvoting comments that they find insightful so others can view it as well. And when we talk about social learning platforms, just as a few examples of what we're talking about, 360 Learning is one that's out there, Open Social. And then there's some other platforms that might not be called social learning platforms. They might be more enterprise communication tools, but they support social learning. And an example of that is Workplace by Meta. But even without an LMS or a specific platform that supports this type of asynchronous social learning, organizations can work to establish learning communities with communication tools that are already in place, such as Teams and Slack. They can do this by creating specific channels or groups where users can ask questions and share their own knowledge and ideas. So sometimes it's a matter of getting a little creative, right, for L&D professionals with the tools that are already in place and that they know learners are already using regularly. And it's important to, of course, foster a learning culture with these tools that's so important for collaborative and social learning to be effective. So with that, we'll go ahead and pause for this trend. Any questions related to collaborative and social learning?
All right, let's give it a second. So if you're doing collaborative learning, we have a question of, is that collaborating with the trainer or collaborating with the other people that you're taking the class with? And what happens if someone in the class gets the concept faster than everyone else? How would that be handled?
I'll start, Lauren. Yeah, I'll start, and then I'd love for you to weigh in. When we look at social and collaborative learning, it really, people like to teach and they learn from that, as well as they like to share and they like to learn from others. So largely collaborative and social learning is learning from their peers. However, certainly it can extend to training managers, it can extend to coaches and managers. So it takes a team as well. Usually what happens, if someone's getting a concept quicker than others, usually that's just a great way. It's another modality of those that aren't getting it to learn from those that are. Lauren, thoughts on that?
Yeah, completely agree. I think one of the biggest challenges we hear from clients across the board, and I think this probably applies to all industries, is how do you handle mixed groups of learners, right? Some who come in with more experience, more knowledge, or maybe faster learners than others, or quicker to adopt technology than others. How do we handle that, right? This is, I think, a challenge that L&D professionals have faced for years, regardless of what technology or modality we're talking about. But collaborative and social learning is really about how do you leverage the skills and knowledge among peers to help teach each other, right? So how do you get them to share? How do you get them to discuss? And I would just also add, Shaun, based on what you said, it's really important to have the right facilitator for that. So if we're talking about a workshop where you're going to have, small groups working on group projects where the goal really is that peer-to-peer knowledge sharing, I think it's important for the facilitator to know their job is not instructing, their job is facilitating that peer-to-peer knowledge. So, that distinction between instructor versus trainer versus facilitator is important to keep in mind when we're talking specifically about collaborative learning.
That's great, Lauren. I would agree. I mean, it turns back to, making sure that we're learner-centric. And I also am a firm believer in, is to teach is to learn. And so I think that it's a great point about the facilitator.
Thank you both. I will say I'm willing to share all of my knowledge with the group for the low price of a peanut butter sundae from Dairy Queen. So, whatever you need to know, I'll tell you. But those are all the questions we have for this section.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thanks for the questions. So next, we're going to take a look at learning trend 4, which is message-based learning. So what is message-based learning? So message-based learning, much as the name would imply, delivers learning via messages where learners spend most of their time, which is on their mobile device. So message-based learning, whether it's via SMS messaging, email, other communication channels, the benefit here is it's where people are at, right? It can include text, it can include multimedia, and it can include links to information. So message-based learning, it's built upon well-established learning strategies, including microlearning, learning in the flow of work. So as someone's working, they can receive a text, they can respond to a question, and they can also, prior to that, they can consume content delivered via text message. So now I understand why team members are on their phones texting so much, but that's kind of a bad joke. And then of course, message-based learning, it utilizes spaced continuous learning that reduces cognitive load. Message-based learning is accessible, it's scalable, and it's digestible. So before we move on, let's conduct a poll regarding your organization's use of message-based learning. Stephanie, can you pull up the message-based learning poll?
All right, it is right there on the screen for you. Let's find out who's using it.
Sure.
All right, these responses are coming in fast, with the majority of the people are not using it yet, but planning to is inching up there. Give you all just a minute or two more to get your responses into the poll. And if you want to expand on your response in the chat, feel free. All right, I will share these results. So there you can see them on the screen.
Great. So 23% already using it. And then, then we go to not currently using it, but planning to, and then not using it or not planning to use it. So interesting. It's one of the things that I find fascinating about message-based learning, or I guess just communication in general. Usually if I have to get a hold of, let's just say my sister, if I send an email, usually it doesn't garner a response. If I send her a text, it garners a response. So, texting is a powerful platform, and granted, message-based texting, it can be message-based learning, can be via email communication channels as well as texting, but it's kind of moving into a new direction that we haven't seen before. So let's take a look. There's a platform that we've been exposed to. It's an innovative platform. It's called Arist. And Arist, interestingly enough, it's a text-based learning platform that's also taking advantage of other platforms too that I'll get to in a second. But It was initially developed to teach and train students in the Yemen conflict zone. And so here, internet was limited, but text messaging was abundant. And so they realized that they had an opportunity to educate and train students by using text messages because that was a reliable means of communication. So with this platform, text messages are pulsed out each day to learners. It consists of an image, 1,200 characters or up to, and an interactive question. So this will then, usually it's every day, and this can go on for anywhere from 5 days to 30 days. A typical RS lesson takes no more than 5 minutes. They equate, and we're still working with them on how to make this comparison, but it's interesting that they equate 5 minutes of an RS course or RS lesson is the equivalent of 20 to 30 minutes in typical online learning. They've used it in compliance training, DE&I training, leadership training, to name a few. I think we all can agree text messaging is versatile and it's also accessible. And so while we've still been experimenting with this platform, as we see opportunities, we also see limitations. I think learning this trend is here to stay. And whether it's using SMS messaging, WhatsApp, Slack, and Teams, it truly meets the modern learner where they are. So the next kind of learning case use of message-based learning is email. And so not all message-based learning needs to be done via a technology platform like Arist. Google coined the term whisper course. And so this is where they'll send a series of emails that include micro lessons and behavioral nudges. They developed this approach based on the notion that we all know that learning doesn't always happen in a classroom. And also based on the notion, which I think we all know, Ebbinghaus had the forgetting curve. And that states basically that, people can forget 50% of what they've learned in an hour and 90% of what they learned in a week. At least I think those are the numbers, but I may have forgotten them. Anyway, bad joke. And then to kind of continue this thought process, the whisper courses can include a brief tip. Thanks for the smile. A brief tip or concept, an example of what great or what good looks like, and then also a call to action. So I know this was a quick one, but I'm going to pause here and see if there's any questions or comments on message-based learning.
We are getting a lot of chatter about message-based learning. So first question, would you include chatbots in the definition of message-based learning?
That's a great question. I'm going to have Lauren weigh in on that.
That's a good question. Technically speaking, where that falls, I'm not entirely sure of which category it would fall under. I would probably consider it in a category of its own because, typically if it's a chatbot, like it's leveraging some AI to pull from a source of knowledge. There's a bank of knowledge on the back end that's being leveraged for that chat box. So I personally would put it in its own category, as opposed to within message-based learning, which I typically think of as, there's pre-planned courses, there's a sequence that's going to be pulsed out in a certain cadence, where I would view a chatbot as different, more for just-in-time learners. Yeah.
Awesome.
Good question, though.
Thank you. So then, as you were talking about kind of like a pre-planned curriculum, how can message-based learning be tracked through your LMS? Is that something that can be done?
I know that message-based learning can be tracked, and there's a comprehensive reporting function that ARIST, say in particular, I'll speak to that first, that they have. As far as it is my understanding that they are able to then kind of sort of track back into the LMS, but we can follow up with you, Stephanie, on that question.
Okay, perfect.
Lauren, any thoughts that you have on that?
My understanding is the same, that they have their own, data analytics that they have on the back end. They can, because you can even respond to a message. They can ask a question, you text a response back. All of that's being collected on the back end. In terms of integration to the LMS, I think we would need to follow up on that in terms of some of the technicality behind that. Yeah, great question.
All right, and then here's a follow-up about the ARIST tool. Have you used it as only a standalone course, or can you also use it as part of a larger course, like as a review or a check-in, in the middle of the course?
That's a great question, and it's kind of what we ponder in using it. We haven't, being in the life science space, we have some pretty complex content, and the duration of some of the, while we abide by micro learning, we don't want cognitive overload. There's a lot of curriculum that newly hired sales professionals need to go through. And while ARIST positions the platform as almost a replacement to the e-learning courses that we know and love, such as Articulate Storyline, Rise, and Adapt, we haven't found that we're able to replace it, but to supplement it. So we use it as learning engagement and learning retention, as kind of, building muscle memory on what folks have learned in that foundational learning.
Great. And then another question, with the message-based learning, is there an instructor responding individually to the answers? Can the answers be visible, and is this viable for large audiences?
So it is viable for large audiences. I'll let Lauren answer the first part of that question, because I think you have more experience with the ARIST platform.
Yeah, I think in terms of responses, there's automated feedback that can be leveraged there, just like you would in a knowledge check, or if you're, pulsing out a question. So there's an element of automation there, because it is positioned as a platform that is scalable, that the amount of time and effort to go into building a message-based course via ARIST can reach, let's say thousands of learners with the same effort that it would if it were 20 learners. So in terms of scalability, that's a strength of the platform. So it's certainly not relying on an instructor to respond individually to each question or response that comes in on the part of the learner. But we can follow up and look a little bit deeper into the types of questions and what can be automated versus what would require some facilitation in terms of responding to individual learners. It's a really good question.
Great, thank you. And then last question, then I'll let you guys move on to your next portion. Do you think that message-based learning would work well for very technical occupations like nursing or healthcare? Do you see that being a good fit?
Yeah, sure. I think that message-based learning, when used appropriately or used correctly, I think it can be used in any industry, healthcare workers, clinical, technical. I think it's a nice way to augment what they're currently using.
I would agree. And I think with the ability to leverage text, multimedia, so pulsing out a video or a graphic, that maybe is something they've already seen, but just bringing it back to the forefront in terms of resetting that forgetting curve for the sake of learning retention is really powerful. So, and even with, knowledge check questions. So we see a lot of learning retention platforms that have a similar purpose in terms of resetting that forgetting curve, pulsing out questions, let's say every couple of days or every week, so that learners are recalling what they learned, let's say a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago. It can have a similar result there, but it's not just limited to questions, right? It also can be content to expand upon what was already introduced, or even pulse out, best practices post a workshop that were collected. That's just another simple use case that I think would apply across industries.
All right, thank you so much. That is all the questions right now.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Right. Yeah,
and thank you for the questions. Great questions.
All right, we'll dive into our last but not least learning trend number 5, immersive learning. It's likely no surprise that we've included this as a top learning trend of today. Chances are you've been hearing the buzz around AR and VR for some time now, but we're really starting to see how AR and VR technology is showing up in our everyday experiences. I think back to when Pokemon Go really took off years ago. People started to really see and understand, first of all, just what AR is and how it can be used in a game. We've only continued to then see more examples showing up in everyday life. So some ones that you might be familiar with, Sherwin-Williams Color Snap Visualizer, or the IKEA mobile app to visualize, paint or furniture and how it would look in your home. Most recently, Zoom introduced studio effects to customize your facial effects on a Zoom call, which maybe some of you have experimented with. But if you're a gamer or if you have a gamer in your household, you also might be familiar with the use of VR video games, and probably more familiar than myself as I'm not a gamer, but these are also becoming much more popular. And as we see AR and VR technology just showing up in our everyday lives, we can see that it's becoming more accessible and also more cost effective. So as a result, we're finding that many L&D professionals are looking for opportunities to create these immersive experiences for their learners. So we're just going to share a few examples of how we're currently leveraging AR and VR technology in the work that we do. So the first here is incorporating responsive AR enhancements in e-learning. Because of recent advancements in AR, the barriers for use, including cost and equipment, have really dropped significantly, and we no longer need fancy equipment or special apps to be able to utilize it. Even 3D stock image libraries have become more robust, and all of this is making it more accessible and cost-effective to incorporate it into our learning experiences. So one way we've taken advantage of this is to embed AR experiences directly into our e-learning modules, whether that's Rise, Adapt, or Storyline. So I'll play this so you can see it on screen. But e-learning, tends to be lacking that tactile element that many learners want, but typically don't get when they're learning remotely. And so doing this allows our end users to interact with and visualize challenging concepts like anatomy and physiology, disease state, and mechanism of action of a product. So the example you're seeing playing here is actually from some training that we developed at Illuminate early on in the pandemic, and it's of a COVID-19 virus. So learners could interact with it, spin it around, even put it on their desk using their mobile devices. But we see this as a really great way to create a more immersive experience for medical, scientific, and even technical training. Another way that we're leveraging AR is to create engaging gamification experiences at live training events. So this particular example is called the Great Jewel Heist. And here participants work in small teams to compete in an AR scavenger hunt as they demonstrate knowledge and skills to reinforce their learnings from home study or from pre-work prior to the meeting. Basically, teams select a jewel and they follow clues to locate that jewel on site at the event location. Once they find it, they scan it on their devices using AR to unlock questions, and then they complete timed questions on their devices and could even respond to verbalization prompts if we needed more application-based training to be embedded. Those could be judged by facilitators, and as they do this, they're then able to advance so that they can locate more jewels on site and ultimately continue in the competition. So this has proven to be a really great way to engage learners, provide them with an immersive experience and a different experience than what they're used to. But of course, also just foster team building and competition at a live meeting, which can also be just a really powerful way to foster collaboration among a team. So next, we're going to look at VR. Shaun, do you mind taking this one?
Sure. So we're all familiar with VR, and it's a technology that's existed as early as 1960s. In the life science learning and development space, we've seen VR more slowly adopted than what we suspect other industries have been adopting it Lauren referenced costs, and I think that in the, say, past 5 to 10 years, it has significantly come down. However, like we've seen in the space that over the past several years, we've seen the utilization of it as well as the desire to use it, it's exponentially increased. And we all know that by simulating and stimulating as many senses as possible, such as vision, hearing, touch, even smell, our world is transformed to an immersive world. VR has been particularly helpful in our space, as being able to immerse our learners in with complex scientific topics. So, with VR, they can explore the respiratory tract or they can explore the circulatory system. We've also seen clients use it and ask for it for a disease episodic reenactment. So, for example, a migraine attack or a seizure. Additionally, so those, the two top screens are VR that has been done in the life science space. And of course, and I think everybody here is familiar with scenario VR. So we've seen uptake in tools such as scenario VR. It's easy to use authoring tool that developers can create an immersive learning experience, driving engagement, retention, and performance. While our space has a bit to go of VR adoption, we see it as a trend, much like many of the other trends we've talked about, that truly will transform life sciences, how it's delivered. So I'm going to pause there and see if there's any questions on immersion.
Yeah, we did have a question about the virus object that you were showing rotating in that one course. Do you know what platform was used to create that?
That's a great question. So I believe that was done in Adapt, but Lauren, do you happen to know what platform? I know it was published in an Adapt course, but.
Yep, and using 360 imagery. So again, because that's becoming so much more accessible, there's, it's becoming a lot easier, right, to be able to implement into our modules. Yeah, good question.
All right, I think that is all the questions so far. Oh, wait, we got one more that just popped in. How would you create a storyboard for an immersive course? Like, how would that be laid out? Do you have any tips or a specific tool that you use to do that?
That's a great question. We would use, or we do use our standard. We have a couple different storyboards. One is for e-learning and then one is from a multimedia. So we use the multimedia storyboard.
And one last question, have you used haptic technologies in your training?
I have not used it. Lauren?
Nope, I'm not.
Oh, okay. All right. I lied when I said last question. More just keep coming. So Karen says, the challenge we are facing is the cost effectiveness of XR/VR. Do you see a lot of potential for widespread implementation? And maybe could you share some ways to lower that cost?
So that's a great question, and we hear it all the time. And back to that we've seen VR, AR, it's been slow to adopt in the life sciences. I think it's because of that very issue of cost. And it's in the past we've also built virtual preceptorships that are not inexpensive, and the adoption or use of that is the inhibition is cost. And so we continue to work on it. I'm not sure I can give any tips on how to reduce the costs. If anyone out there knows them, I'd love to hear them too. But that's unfortunately the challenge of VR. Lauren, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I would just add, I know through a lot of agencies or companies, you can rent equipment. So in terms of, if it's not something that's going to be used on a regular basis, purchasing versus renting, that's something to evaluate. But also just in terms of leveraging it for training, I think if it's just a shiny tool, there's not going to be, much, there's not going to be a great ROI on it, right? It needs to bring value. It needs to be something that's effective. And so when it comes to training that, learners aren't going to be able to do, let's say, safely or in a way that's accessible that they can do via VR, that's when, as the value goes up, not necessarily that the cost comes down, but it makes it, the return on investment is higher. So that's just something I would add.
Thanks,
Great,
Lauren.
thank you. Those are all the questions we have right now.
Thank you, Stephanie. So last slide is just a very big thank you for your time. And we'd love to hear from you if there are any trends that you think we need to investigate for next time, please feel free to share them. And then also if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. So thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.